It is our distinct pleasure today to offer this very timely and mission-critical presentation on environmental advocacy by Dr. Barbara Sattler. Dr. Sattler is an international leader in environmental health and nursing and a fellow in the American Academy of Nursing. She is a registered nurse with a doctor in public health degree from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. She has been an advisor to the EPA's Office of Child Health Protection and the National Library of Medicine for informational needs of health professionals on environmental health. Dr. Sattler was a founding member of the Alliances of Nurses for Healthy Environments, an international organization that is helping to integrate environmental health, including climate change, into nursing education, practice, research, and policy and advocacy. She is the author of Environmental Health in Nursing, as well as a plethora of peer-reviewed articles on issues related to environmental health. She is Professor Emeritus and continuing adjunct faculty at the University of San Francisco. Dr. Sattler is a friend, colleague, and a mentor to a growing army of environmental activists in nursing. Thank you very much for being here with us today, Dr. Sattler, and with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Alexa. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm very excited about being among nurse leaders in the state of California. And so let's get started. So I'd like you to take just 1 minute here and consider what you would say if your neighbor were to say to you, you know, you're a nurse. Can you just tell me what climate change is? And I'd like you to take just a second here to in your head, imagine what your response would be. And how comfortable and confident your response would be. And I have to say that I've given presentations on climate change starting with this question to doctoral students at Columbia University in the nursing program. And a lot of them and many nurses don't have a lot of confidence in being able to answer this question. So I'm going to start by how I might answer this question. Obviously, a little bit more elaborately than you would answer it for your neighbor. But I'm going to start out by showing you here a picture of what Earth has looked like for millennia now. The sun has been beating down on the Earth. It warms the oceans to a certain degree. It warms the Earth and the land masses. And then some of that heat has been getting reflected out and out beyond our atmosphere. And that combination of the heat of the sun and our ability to get rid of that heat out into the, beyond the atmosphere, that combination has kept us at temperatures and climate that has allowed us to flourish on Earth, allowed those in the ocean as well as the land. And so I'd like you to think about something that all of you are familiar with. You go, you park your car in a parking garage or a parking lot on a hot day, windows closed, lock the door, go inside for a little while and shop, and you come out, and what happens is you open that door, and it is so much hotter inside than it was outside. What is happening in this instance is the sun is coming, and it's heating up the inside of the car, but there's no way for that heat to be released out unless you left your windows open. And so these numbers that you see here, that if it's 80 degrees outside, that within 10 minutes of being in a sunny place, inside can be 99 degrees. And this little rubric was created by an advocacy group that advocates for people not to leave their children in their cars when they go in to shop. But obviously the essence of this is understood by everybody. Now, what we have developing to a point of critical mass is that we are creating certain kinds of gases, and most of it is man-made. Some of it can be created by fires, but most of these gases that are now being called greenhouse gases are engulfing the Earth. And so whereas we were able to, before, release some of that heat beyond our atmosphere, it is now being captured to a certain extent. And it's like we have a blanket around the earth that is keeping us and getting us warmer and warmer. And these greenhouse gases are going to be part and parcel of what I'm going to be talking about most of this talk. So what we've created with these greenhouse gases, and this is why we call them that, is a greenhouse effect. And that is overall warming the earth. And so that is being called global warming. But the reason that we've changed some of the nomenclature is that while the earth is warming as a whole, we're seeing different kinds of climatic results and not always just heating up. So what is creating these greenhouse gases? You can see from the size of the balloons here, the percent of the sectors that are contributing. And the number one biggest, of course, is energy. So these are all fossil fuel created energy sources. And it includes the extraction, it includes refining, it includes combustion when we drive our cars or heat our homes or heat our gas stoves. We also see that industries, a variety of industries, to include the healthcare industry, as well as transportation and agriculture and forestry, all have a play in this. So, as I said, global warming got people confused in the sense that, sometimes in the Northeast in the U.S., they'd say, oh, we had really, really cold winter this year, so how could we have global warming? Well, the truth is that climate change is a better frame for this, because you can have cold winters in New York City, but still be seeing global climate change happening. And so that indeed is what is going on. And just another little distinction here, that weather is what kind of happens from day to day, but climate is what happens overall over longer periods of time and is averaged over time. So in essence, what we have going on right now is a fever. And we all know as nurses that at 98.6, we flourish as human beings. I mean, that's a healthy temperature for us. We also know that it doesn't take very many degrees more, 100.4, and suddenly we're not feeling well. Suddenly we're not flourishing. And if those temperatures increase even higher, our bodily systems begin to break down. And so what happens if the whole earth is warming? We do know that life on earth, pretty much all of the flora and fauna on earth needs these basics, with very few exceptions: sunlight, water, air, some kind of food or sustenance, and also they need a range of temperature. So if we begin to increase the temperature, not only do human beings not feel well when we have fevers, but many of our plants and our animals and our sea mammals, many of them are starting to show clear signs of failure. And when we think about over the millennia, we've had changes in climate, but if they happen ever so slowly, it means that plants and animals can adapt in a Darwinian form. But the bottom right is a redwood. A redwood could live 1,000 years. That doesn't have time to adapt to the changes that we're seeing in climate. And in fact, in Northern California, the redwoods need the fog. And if we have less fog, we're apt to have some failure in our redwoods. So another thing, and I'm not going to get too geeky here for you or on you, is that it's really important that we keep the ocean's temperatures from heating up, because these temperatures and these currents that we have flowing around the globe help to keep us in the climate that we need to flourish. So these are the general long-term currents, and then we have smaller currents called gyres. And some of you are familiar with El Niños, La Niñas. These are the result of these gyres changing. And so we may see More impacts from El Niños, more impacts from La Nina. So more rain and less rain in large quantities in both directions. So I'd like us to also think about what are our underlying diseases. Whenever we do a history and physical with our patients, we always ask them about their previous and current diseases. And so I'd like to just quickly talk about what is going on Earth right now that are our underlying diseases. And one is a huge loss of biodiversity. And some of this biodiversity includes our pollinators, who are required for us in terms of food production. But also, we are connected to each other in many, many, many ways. And so by losing biodiversity, we are threatening the biosphere, essentially, of Earth. We also know that overall global air pollution is worsening. In California, 5 of the 10 worst cities in the country in terms of particulate matter air pollution, 5 of them are in California. So this is of particular interest to us in California as we take care of patients with asthma, with COPD, with other chronic diseases that are worsened by air pollution. And in fact, we've got very good science about increased risk for low birth weight babies and premature births in association with air pollution and particulate matter. We also know all too well that we've had incredible loss of forests, some of those from intentional fires in the global south. What I want you to note here is that 28% of the world's oxygen comes from tropical forests. This is important because we need to have a certain percent of oxygen in our air in order for us as humans to flourish, not to mention the rest of the beings on Earth. Our oceans, unfortunately, are also dying and being affected in large scale, and not just by climate change, but also because of what we're doing with runoff of fertilizers that are creating dead zones in some of the areas where our rivers are coming out into our oceans, and also overfishing is killing some of our oceans. But climate change is a huge component of that. And phytoplankton is responsible for the vast majority of oxygen that is produced. And please look at this. 70% of the globe's oxygen comes from the oceans. If indeed we are stressing out our oceans too much, they will not, and the plankton will not be producing oxygen. I want us as nurses to think about what this means if we don't have enough oxygen in our atmosphere. So that's more about sort of globally. What's happening in terms of specifically human frailty? We know COVID has been a huge stressor. We know that overpopulation is contributing to a variety of health, of both morbidity and mortality issues. Extreme poverty, hunger, lack of good nutrition, wars, homelessness, racial injustice, and the special vulnerabilities always of children and elderly. These are sort of the frailties of humans that we start with, and then we overlay climate change. This slide that I'm showing you right now, I prepared 20 years ago for my first presentation on climate change to the American Public Health Association. And all of these issues were things that we had very good science about 20 years ago, that climate change was going to create a public health emergency, create the potential for planetary destabilization because of what may be happening with droughts, with food production, with a variety of other things, with sea level rise, and that there were clear health and safety implications then. This list that you see in front of you is still the list that we need to worry about, and 20 years have gone by. So we need to get really busy. We're still concerned about sea level rises, and we've got a huge coast in California and several bays that will be at risk, including the San Francisco Bay Area and some of the bays in the Southern California area. We completely understand about extreme storm events, including those dry storm events with winds that increase fire hazards. that we're starting already to see critical changes. This has been a very dry year. We're going to probably have another one of the hottest years on record this year. The combination of dry and hot is going to challenge our agricultural systems for producing food. This in turn will create food insecurity, especially for our most vulnerable populations. That combination of drought and fires, obvious to most of you. Increased heat waves, I'm going to talk about those, which we already have about 1 million people in the state of California that do not have potable water coming out of their water faucets. This both from the fact that they've run out of water in their aquifers, as well as because of water that they can't drink because of contaminants. And we're seeing increased morbidity and mortality associated directly with climate change. And as I mentioned, species extinction. But we're also seeing climate refugees. There are many people that are leaving the Central American countries and Mexico because of violence in their communities, but there are also many more that are leaving because they've had extreme drought for long periods and they cannot sustain their families with their small-scale farms any longer. So we're seeing crop failures, and COVID has been a multiplier effect. So the photo that you see in the middle and the middle right are both people standing in line because of food insecurity secondary to what has happened to them economically because of COVID. So once again, these vulnerabilities that are going to start piling up on each other. Some of the other photos are from other countries, but I want us to recognize that here in California, these vulnerabilities exist absolutely. We also know that we're seeing more extended excessive heat periods, and this is expected to increase. You can see that the health-related deaths that are projected will increase by 257% by 2050. We need to prepare for those, and we are ill-prepared for these excessive heat events, particularly in Northern California, where we do not regularly have air conditioning in our homes. It was not something that we needed. But I want us to also think about who are our most vulnerable populations to heat. They are our farm workers, they are construction and utility workers, our homeless populations, our populations who have mobility issues, obviously our elderly who may have mobility issues, but also are housebound for a variety of other issues, as well as those who are cognitively impaired. And there's nurse leaders who may be working in health systems or in individual hospitals, mapping where the vulnerable populations are in your communities for a variety of disaster preparedness reasons would be very well advised, and specifically noting around excessive heat events, but it will also be, God forbid, we have an earthquake. Certainly, we've had enough fires to understand that's a risk. So there are a variety of reasons why we may want to really be involved in local mapping. And it's not necessarily something that's going on in your community, just so you know. We also, I mentioned sea rise. You can see that California is a state with in medium threat here from sea rise, something that we need to be aware of. In the San Francisco Bay Area, they are talking about increasing a seawall, building a giant seawall around the Bay Area. This is something that we're considering because the science is showing us that this is going to create a risk in the future. These storm surges that we have can create risks for more habitat for mosquitoes and rats and other vectors of disease. They also create the conditions for mold. That picture on the top right was taken in my community in the Russian River area, where we have floods every couple of years, and there are other areas in Northern California and other parts of California where we do have flooding. Another thing I want to show you is many of you have seen the recent picture of Highway 1 where it crashed down. When we have extreme storm events and we lose parts of our roads, this becomes a critical issue for people accessing hospitals when there are emergencies, when women are in labor. So our infrastructure and keeping our infrastructure in really good shape is a health care emergency issue. We're also seeing longer and wetter seasons in some parts of the country. And in the southern parts of the country, we're now seeing malaria-carrying mosquitoes where we never saw them before, or where we rarely saw them before. Because our growing seasons are stretching out because of climate change, some of the allergens that come from our plants, the pollens, are now having longer periods to plague those of us who are allergic and those of us who have asthma that are triggered by allergic events. Increased waterborne diseases are coming from heating our oceans, but also some of the other changes from agricultural runoff. But together, the combination are really challenging our oceans. And I want maybe some of you to recall, I don't know whether you are crab eaters. I come from Maryland, where Maryland is all about crabs. But California, Northern California, we have a pretty robust crabbing industry. And 3 or 4 years ago, we had a red tide here that prevented crabbers from crabbing for that whole season. And that can have, obviously, an economic impact on a whole small sector of fishermen who were crabbers. And that these kinds of situations where sectors of industries that are dependent on the flourishing of flora and fauna, once those start diminishing, that's going to affect communities economically. We're also seeing increased risks of certain specific diseases, and I want to call out valley fever because we have a big, long central valley here. Some of the other diseases, heart disease and respiratory disease associated with some of the changes, air pollution, heat, et cetera, are of note. But valley fever, we are seeing increased rates of valley fever. And one of the reasons we're seeing this is the coccidioidomycosis. That's why I call it valley fever. It's just a lot easier to say. The spore that causes this disease is naturally occurring in the soil. But when we have years in a row of drought and the soil is so desiccated, so dry, that when we till it, even though we're only doing perhaps shallow tilling, you can see the picture top right, we are releasing the soil into the air. These spores then become airborne, and then people who live in the Central Valley wind up being exposed to a lot more of these spores than they ever were before. So we are seeing larger and larger numbers of people with valley fever. This is a chronic intermittent disease. I had a 26-year-old master's in public health student a couple of years ago who was diagnosed and sick when he was 16, and at 26, up until that point, had never had a recurrence, and then at 26 had a reoccurrence, not from a re-exposure, but a reoccurrence, because once again, it's a chronic disease, and he wound up hospitalized and in the ICU twice in a semester for this disease. So you can see people often think of it as a lung disease, but it also, these kinds of growths can come in other parts of the body as well. The other thing are these extreme weather events. The top right is a picture of downtown Guerneville, which is in the Russian River Valley in California. So we see those kinds of events here in Northern California and Southern California. I haven't included some of the mudslides and other things that you know are associated with events there. This is something that I predicted, not I personally, but through the science predicted 20 years ago that we would see fires of greater frequency, duration, and heat. And lo and behold, we have started to see those over the last 4 or 5 years. And pretty much any of you nurses that are in the state have had either direct hits. I was evacuated twice where I live, or your hospitals needed to be evacuated, or you received patients from evacuated hospitals. And certainly you probably breathed the air that was contaminated by the fires that we had in both northern, southern, and throughout the Sierras. Disaster planning and response and for evacuating hospitals. This is of increasing criticality. What you see on the left there is the hospital going up in flames. What you see on the bottom right is a set of Kaiser nurses, I believe it was. It could be Sutter, so I apologize, but it was one of the hospitals in Santa Rosa as they evacuated an ICU patient in the middle of the night as the flames were seen in the very close proximity there. Lots of nurses have been heroes in these situations. Bottom left, you see patients who had been inpatients who are now just awaiting being transferred to other hospitals and care centers where they could be readmitted and taken care of. The nurse in the top right worked 24 hours in a row at a hospital helping to evacuate patients at the same time that her house burnt to the ground, and that's what she went home to. So we've got lots of nurse heroes. We also want to note, once again, that climate refugees. And so often we think of the refugees in terms of people in the picture on the far left and the bottom right. But the picture in the middle and the picture of the gymnasium with the yellow floor, these are climate refugees from the fires in California. And some of these refugees were not able to ever go home. Their homes were burned to the ground. So these refugees, if they don't have families and others to care for them, wind up being long-term refugees in our own states, and we have to accommodate for them. These are photos of people that we may see in the shelters that we create for these climate refugees, for fire refugees. And we need to be very aware of their needs. So most of the local health departments, so the public health departments, will help to set up medical shelters, medical needs shelters. We know that if you evacuate a town of 5,000 people, they're not going to all be uniformly healthy. Some of them may be very pregnant. Some of them may have had a baby yesterday. Some of them may have, flu or a cold. Some of them are going to have mobility issues. Some of them may not have their parents with them. Some of them may have mental health issues that are going to be extremely exacerbated by these kinds of events. So we as nurses in our communities, in our hospitals, clinics, in any other settings that we work in our communities, need to be engaged in our emergency preparedness, in our responses as we see more of these in the coming years, to make sure that we take the best care of people when they are in their worst circumstances. And so the vulnerability list, anybody who's taken a public or community health course knows this list: children, elderly, those who are disabled, cognitively impaired, those with existing health issues or mental health issues, and then a whole set of overlay of our undocumented migrants and immigrants that we have in our communities in California, many of whom, when we had shelters set up for fires, were afraid to go to the shelters for fear of ICE and other kinds of risks that they might be facing. This is a whole other issue that I think we as nurses need to be accommodating, and that is that the rebuilding in our communities that have been affected by fires, this rebuilding takes years. I took my students to Coffey Park, which was in Santa Rosa. That's the top left picture there. A whole community burned to the ground. 2 years later, I took my MPH students there, and many of the homes had still not been rebuilt. So many of the people were not coming back into that community, but those few who were trying to rebuild were having to live elsewhere. Their children had to go to several different schools. It's incredibly disrupting to lives, individual family lives, and then whole communities. PTSD is very common. I have people who live in my community that are triggered when people have burn piles that they burn in the area. They are triggered into anxiety. So as nurses, we must be aware of all this. And so what must we do? Well, as nurses, we need to talk about this. We need to talk about it as being an evidence-based crisis. And it's a public health crisis. And in every one of our communities, there was something about climate change that will touch us, regardless of our socioeconomic status. But of course, It will affect those on the lowest economic rung and our communities of color and our immigrant communities the worst. We must continue to educate ourselves about the clinical implications, because after all, we're nurses. And if you are in a position as an educator or working in a management position in a hospital or healthcare setting, invite folks, including other nurses like myself, to come and talk to your staff about climate change. I have nurse colleagues who are in the northeastern part of California who are not getting vaccines. These nurses are also not believers in climate change. We have work to do within our nursing communities to help really make sure that we are evidence-based in how we're addressing all things that have to do with taking care of ourselves and others in our communities. And understanding the science underpinning climate change is one of those. At home, there are things that you can do. You can assess your own carbon footprint. If you just put carbon footprint into your Google search or whatever search you use, you'll find an array of those. It's kind of, if you've got kids and families, kind of a fun thing you can do together. Obviously, conserving energy, because so much of our energy is still reliant on fossil fuels, is important. Conserving our water, also especially important in California. Eliminating plastic. What people don't know is that plastics are a derivative of fossil fuels. So if we want to decrease fossil fuel production and their derivative chemicals and products, eliminating plastics is one of them. We have lots of opportunities in hospitals to eliminate plastic, replace them with other things. When I was a nursing student a zillion years ago, there were no plastic bedpans, emesis basins, or other things like that. They were all made of stainless steel. These are multi-use devices, stainless steel devices that could go on forever, as opposed to plastic urinals or emesis basins, which we now send home with patients. Like, they're going to have something to do with the urinal when they take it home. We can also green our transportations, going to fully electric cars, helping our communities go to fully electric public transportation. Our governor just passed an executive order so that all vehicles sold in the state by 2035 are going to have to be fully electric. So we've got some policies helping to move us in that direction. You probably know the statistic that 30% of all the food that is produced right now in the world, 30% of it goes to waste. When you think of the inputs and the transportation and the fertilizers and often the pesticides that are used to produce that, and then it goes to waste, this is really contributing to climate change. In our communities, every community, major community in California, has a climate action plan. As nurse leaders, it would be very good for you to gather a few of your other nurse leaders in the community and look at that climate action plan. Is there something that you could do to help forward a part of that? Is there something that your hospital system could commit to helping move forward? Is there something your community benefits program might engage in? All of this could be wonderful opportunities for you and your communities. Also engaging in your own community-based organizations, faith-based organizations. Libraries are a wonderful place to aggregate people for education and action. And then organizing our communities once again for resiliency, knowing where our vulnerable populations are, knowing where our cooling centers are going to be, where we would put our medical shelters in our communities, and so forth. Volunteering. Each of you individually can also volunteer. And volunteering means that you can get called up and you have the first right of refusal, but at least it puts you in a system. American Red Cross, Salvation Army, and the Medical Reserve Corps. The Medical Reserve Corps are now doing vaccinations in some of our counties with our county health departments. And then FEMA also has an emergency response team. So any one of these, I think we have more American Red Cross than Salvation Army folks in California. But each of these are opportunities for you to be in a system. So when these emergencies arrive, you can plug in. If you're not already in a system, it's very hard to plug in and volunteer. In our work settings, we can support our green teams. I know that one of the people on the call today here or our Zoom heads up a green team. Also, Lisa Hartmeyer, who's a nurse practitioner at UCSF, is now the national co-chair of the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments Practice Committee. And we are going to be doing a series of workshops on greening your hospitals. I'll talk about that in a minute. And greening your immediate work settings, talking about what you did and why you did it, and then supporting educational efforts. The Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments can help deploy a whole list of nurses who can come and talk to nurses in your work settings, and we would be very happy to do that. Also hosting green meetings, and if you Google ANA Green Meeting Guide, you'll see how we can begin to shift away from using, for instance, plastic bottles of waters at our meetings or other kinds of plastic cups and other things, how we can begin to be more conscious of our everyday usage, purchases, and so forth. Healthcare Without Harm has a whole set of resources for how we can do environmentally preferable purchasing specifically within hospitals. Green teams are a wonderful way of not just gathering nurses in your workplace settings who may want to do something in this area, but actually getting stuff done. And what I've discovered with green teams that I've worked with around the country is it does not take away from their other jobs as nurses. It adds to it, and it adds energy and helps to create more community within your hospitals. And there are lots of ways that you can celebrate. If you look at the top left there, you'll see a bunch of outfits that are made, or things that are made, that are blue, that were made out of recycled blue wrap. And they had a contest for that. We can, and this is incredibly important, especially given that you are all members of a professional association. Working with our professional organizations, for the unions to also be using their voices in the policy arena. This is allowing us to use our collective, powerful, trusted voices as nurses to educate policy makers, including those that are local, our local boards of supervisors, county commissioners, and our, as well as our state officials, elected officials, and regulatory officials. You can take positions on important pieces of legislation that are being proposed right now that are going to decrease the amount of reliance on fossil fuels. And for those of you, I don't know whether you have a legislative committee, for those of you that are involved in that or in policy, I would be so happy to come and talk about some of the specific policies that are going to help us be more resilient and help us be preventative at the further destruction that is going to be occurring with climate change. Also joining coalitions. We as nurses can join Green California, which is a wonderful group of organizations that work on both environmentalism, but also environmental health and social justice and environmental justice. And so these are all, I think, the responsibilities that we have as nurse leaders, and hoping that you will see some ways in for yourself. So greenhouse gases. This is not generally nurses' expertise. I'll give you that. There are only the rare birds like myself who pay a lot of attention to these things because I teach environmental health. But it's not our expertise except as it relates to human health. And in each one of these boxes, there is something that relates directly to human health where we can bring our voices to the policies, to the practices, to our climate healthy plans in our cities and our counties. And for each one of these balloons that you see here, the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, starting April 30th and every 3 weeks, are going to be doing 4 our workshops, so significant workshops about the human health issues associated with these sectors. And we're doing it with the American Lung Association. We're doing it with some of the nursing unions who are reaching out to their members. We would love to do it with you as well, reaching out to the nurses that are in your hospitals, health systems, et cetera. And we will keep you apprised of these workshops should you be interested in attending. On food and agriculture, this is of particular interest to us in California because we're such a big agricultural state. We do have a food and agriculture committee. We meaning the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, are now working with the 9 chapters of the National Association of Hispanic Nurses in California on a workshop series about farm workers. Farm workers are at very high risk for the results of and impacts of climate change, but they're also at high risk for pesticide exposures, for food insecurity, for living in substandard housing, and a wide range of other things. So we're working on these sort of layers of issues and working in coalition. We also have our members of the coalition that includes farmers, to talk about how we can make sure that we are supporting our local small and medium-sized farms in the state, which are under siege right now. For any of you who have any interest in this and want to watch a very positive film about how agriculture can positively impact climate change, I recommend the movie Kiss the Ground. It's narrated by Woody Harrelson. It's really terrific, and it's also I often talk a little gloomy and doomy, but that movie is not. So I want to start by saying, if you think, or not start, but continue to say, if you think that some other nurse will be an awesome advocate, well, think again. You are the awesome advocate. Join our Zoom-based nursing advocacy trainings, which we are going to be doing monthly, starting in April. Just learning, if you've not been an advocate in the past, if you've not written a letter to the editor, if you've not spoken with your local policymakers, this is going to be an opportunity to participate in a skills lab, gain the confidence, gain the skills to do that. And this is what's really interesting right now, is that you don't have to take a trip to Sacramento because all the policymakers are meeting and greeting people via Zoom in the same kind of boxes that we're in right now. So if you join in some of our skills lab, we will be helping you to then participate in these advocacy sessions, talking to our policymakers about things that are related to health. And if you think you need to be a climate change expert, you do not. You need to be a nurse bringing your voice about the basic concerns that you will have and do have around climate change. So the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, as I've said numbers of times, we have a California chapter that is emerging here. We will be doing both trainings and educations and workshops, and also try to keep as many nurses who want to be kept in the loop about important policies that are coming down the pike. And what we're hoping is that you will join us in taking action and that you as an organization will help us as well. So you've heard about thinking globally and acting locally. Well, I want us to think globally and act at home and within our institutions, nationally, regionally, and locally. And with that, I'd just like us to see our beautiful, precious Earth. This is an actual photograph that was taken from one of the NASA missions. This is, in fact, our home. It is our only home. I know that there are some people that are trying to figure out how they're going to get to Mars and set up shop there, but that's probably not for us right now. And that as nurses, we have a responsibility. I think there are so many things we can be doing now, so many things we can be joining together on, and doing it in a way that feels organically right, all scurrying around trying to find vaccines as you are all trying to do your best taking care of your communities. I still think there's a little room for you also to be involved in this work as well. And so with that, I just thank you for giving me this huge opportunity to talk with you. I hope this has been helpful as a primer And I'm going to stop sharing now and welcome any questions that you will have. And this is my email. Also welcome you to email me, bsattler@usfca.edu. That's University of San Francisco, California.edu. Thanks so much. And I
Dr. Sattler, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time to share this with the ACNL membership today. I do have one comment in the comment section. I'm going to encourage the audience to please type in any questions, comments that you want to share with Dr. Sattler. The first one came from Mary Lynn Knighton, who's one of our co-chairs for our Health Policy Committee. We were the sponsors of this particular presentation and want to personally invite you to come meet with us to talk to the actual Health Policy Committee so we can learn more about engagement and action taking. And certainly we develop communications for state membership as well, so it would be really great. There is a question about whether we can get a copy of the presentation.
Yes, the presentation apparently is being recorded right now. And Jacob, the staff person, has said that it's going to be on your website. So, and I don't know how soon that's going to happen, but presumably within the next week.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And that is with the voiceover. If there are people here who would like copies of my slides, you need to email me, and I'll put that, once again, I'll put my email in the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Jacob just posted that the recording will be available at acnl.org later on today.
Perfect. Thank you, Jacob.
All right. Any more questions? Very inspiring, I must say.
Well, if there are, I'll await. Oh, there's a hand up by Mary Lynn.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dr. Sattler. This was so wonderful and very, very eye-opening. I wondered if you might put in the chat the link for the trainings or the group that you were offering that's going to be starting up soon. I'm actually meeting with a group of master's students for Cal State Fullerton tonight to talk about advocacy, and I'd love to be able to let them know that this is something where they can get involved, learn more, et cetera.
Sure. I don't have a specific link, but I'm wondering if, and I don't know whether this is true, did people register for this? So do we have a list?
Yes.
If you have a list, what I'll do is I'll amass a set of links that are just the resources that I talked about here, as well as let you know how you can sign up for the prospective workshops that we're going to be doing. So happy to send you just more information. And by the way, we did a presentation last week that was on a particular chemical that is in the foodware, the takeout foodware. It's a toxic chemical, and two faculty from CSU Fullerton attended that. So you've got some fellow nursing faculty there, and if you want to just email me directly, I'll let you know who your fellow faculty are who are interested in environmental health.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat.
So if I could just say that the Climate Center, and I'm going to put that there, is one of our nurses are part of their, if you just Google the Climate Center in California, we are advising the Climate Center that is working on a bill right now, a Climate Safe California bill. And the Climate Center has wonderful information on that. And the reason for our presence as nurses in the Climate Center is that typically it's been environmental scientists and engineers and folks that are working on renewable energy, and they haven't had the human health voice. I mean, they haven't had that as really a presentation of how they talk about why we should be doing things. So we've been working very closely with them on that. And I just want to talk about one other issue that I didn't cover, but I think it's really important for people to know. We are, I think at this point, about the fourth or fifth largest producer of fossil fuels in the state. So the fossil fuels are produced in Kern County and Southern California, a little bit around the coast, Central Coast. But we also have refineries at the San Francisco Bay Area and lots of refineries along Long Beach. And so as we call for a reduction in fossil fuels and call for ourselves to decelerate our relationship with fossil fuels, this is going to mean that a whole industry is going to go away. And we know as nurses, and certainly our colleague nurses who are in Appalachia and watched the coal industry go away, we watched whole communities implode. They didn't have other options for other employment in the immediate areas. It's no surprise that Kentucky has one of the highest rates of opioid use. They watched their whole state implode because the coal industry effectively has already gone. So in the state of California, given our reliance for employment, good union-paid jobs within the fossil fuel sector, how should we as nurses be part of the conversation for a just transition away from fossil fuels that will make sure that in those communities that get a big chunk of their tax base, their local tax base from these industries, that they won't fall prey to reduced budgets for social services and their health departments and education? How do we make a plan at a state level that says we're going to take into account that we're going to benefit from reducing fossil fuel use because it will benefit climate change? How do we then say we are going to make sure that none of our communities are going to suffer because we're reducing our extraction and refining, et cetera, of fossil fuels? And so nurses need to be in that conversation. How do we keep our communities as vibrant as possible? How do we transition our oil workers into other good, important jobs that are transferable in construction, for instance, of our infrastructure in the state? And so this is nursing leadership, participating in those conversations and thinking like nurses. So thanks. I just wanted to insert that.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sattler. This was a wonderful presentation, and look forward to sharing this. I know Susan Engel has one more comment here, but I think that'll be as part of your presentation with the links is the literature that nurses should be reading on the subject. If you have any favorite books, that would be great.
Correct. Yes. Happy to do that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Everyone have a great day. Thanks for your attendance.